Good morning. Isaiah and the Gospel readings refer to marriage as an expression of God's love, even for God's people who feel desolate. Some prophets, like Hosea, Jeremiah, Joel, and Isaiah, used a metaphor of marriage referring to God the Lord as the bridegroom or husband, and Israel as the bride or wife. We may want to remember that these references come from what was a paternalistic world, one very different in many ways from the one we live in now, though there is firm paternalism abroad today. We may also want to remember that for some, marriage is a reminder of conflict and abuse. Even so, if we picture a groom seeing his bride walk down the aisle, we can appreciate the reference to delight. We may also see the groom's roles, rights, and responsibilities reinterpreted in the light of Jesus, who washed his friends' feet. In the first reading, a third Isaiah, Isaiah of the Restoration, sometime after 538 BCE, speaks to a tired and frustrated people, a people who see themselves, their city, and their country forsaken and desolate. On God's behalf, Isaiah promises rejoicing and delight as at a wedding celebration. Zion refers to the outcrop of rock on which the citadel of Jerusalem was built. It eventually came to refer to the whole area of Jerusalem. Let's listen to his message in Isaiah 62, verses 1 through 5. For Zion's sake, I will not keep silent, and for Jerusalem's sake, I will not rest until her vindication shines out like the dawn and her salvation like a burning torch. The nations shall see your vindication, and all the kings your glory, and you shall be called by a new name that the mouth of the Lord will give. You shall be a crown of beauty in the hand of the Lord, and a royal diadem in the hand of your God. You shall no more be termed forsaken, and your land shall no more be termed desolate. But you shall be called, my delight is in her, and your land married. For the Lord delights in you, and your land shall be married. For as a young man marries a young woman, so shall your builder marry you. And as the bridegroom rejoices over the bride, so shall your God rejoice over you.
Our second and focus reading comes to us from the Gospel of John, reading from the second chapter, verses 1 through 11. We hear Jesus, as Janet told us, turning water into wine at the wedding in Cana in Galilee. And this is often called the first miracle, but Jesus calls it a sign, shifting the focus from the act itself to its significance. Part of the meaning may be in the way that water intended for washing became a high-quality wine in extravagant quantity, over 150 gallons. It is a sign of Jesus' ministry. The message is of grace built on familiar foundations, beyond expectations in quantity and quality. So let us listen closely for the good news for us today in this Gospel from John, in the beginning with the second chapter. On the third day, there was a marriage at Cana in Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there, and Jesus also was invited to the marriage, as well his disciples. When the wine failed, the mother of Jesus said to him, "They have no wine." And Jesus said to her, "O woman, what have you to do with me? My hour has not yet come." His mother said to the servants, "Do whatever he tells you." Now 6 stone jars were standing there for the Jewish rites of purification, each holding 20 or 30 gallons. And Jesus said to them, "Fill the jars with water," and they filled them up to the brim. And he said to them, "Now draw some out and take it to the steward of the feast." So they took it, and when the steward of the feast tasted the water, now become wine, and did not know where it came from, though the servants who had drawn the water knew. The steward of the feast called the bridegroom and said to him, "Every man serves the good wine first, and when men have drunk freely, then the poor wine. But you have kept the good wine until now." This, the first of his signs, Jesus did at Cana in Galilee, and manifested his glory, and his disciples believed in him. The word of the Lord. We give praise and thanks. Amen. Now, I say roughly 150 gallons of wine. They say 20 to 30, so it could be anywhere from the spectrum of 120 gallons plus to a little less than 180 gallons. So 150 seems to be a good round estimate to work with. In our terms, it would equate to about 30 cases of wine. That's 12 bottles to a case, 360 bottles of wine. Now, my question is, how much wine is too much? In the ancient days, in Jesus' time, a wedding usually took place, a normal wedding, about 7 days, and culminates with the wedding of the bride and groom. And so, obviously, the festivities have been going on for several days, probably even into the seventh day. And so there was an ample amount of wine that was provided, except that the bridegroom apparently miscalculated for the last few hours of their wedding. And so Jesus steps in to the rescue. But just think, with 30 cases of wine, just to supply people for a few hours after been drinking for 6 days plus, there was probably an ample amount of wine left over. And so the bride and the bridegroom established their home, and their friends most likely took the leftover wine and placed them in containers and sealed it up for them and put it into storage into their house. And for that first month or so of being in the new marriage, they probably would open up the wine rather freely, saying, "Look at all this good wine that we have," and serve wine with each meal. But after even just a few days, I think they would realize that even with that large amount of wine, there would be an end of it. And so they began saving it for special occasions, for births of their children, for celebrating their anniversary, for celebrating the high holy days. And so they began their march through life as husband and wife. Finally, they were coming to the end of their years. And it was a cold night, maybe like it was last night. And the wife is sitting before the fire, and her husband walks into the room through the doorway and stops and looks at her, and then turns around and goes back, and he comes back with a container of wine. And he sits down beside her and he says, "Honey, this is our last bit of the wine. You and I know that you're chilled to the bone, and maybe as we drink this, it will help warm you up." And she says, "Yes, darling, let's do that." And so he opens the container and pours out the wine into a single cup and hands it to her, and she takes a sip. And then the firelight reflects in her eyes, and a slight smile, turns her lips upwards. And she says with a chuckle, "I remember our first child, Sarah, when she was born, and how you carried on, and I thought you were going to open every container of wine back then in celebration. It was like you were the only person that ever had a child." And not to be undone, the husband looks at her with a twinkle in his eye, and he says, "Yes, but honey, remember when Benjamin and Rebecca, our grandchildren, were born, and how you carried on. Like they were the only grandchildren that had ever come on, and you were bringing out the containers of wine and sharing them with everyone." And then a tear begins to form in her eye. And her husband looks at her and he says, I know what you're thinking. You're remembering when our third child died. It was a hard time. We blamed each other. And I would come back from work and you would be setting the table and we would be just going through the motions of a routine life and not talking with one another. And in that pain, for some reason, I went and got a container of wine and opened it up. And as we sat at the table sharing the wine, the tears began to flow, and we began talking once more. And the grace that this wine imbued upon us didn't take away the grief, but helped heal us in our relationship so that we could be at this point now. He turns the bottle upright and lets the last bit of the wine flow out. And he says, here, honey, this is all the wine that's left. You take a sip. And she takes the smallest of sips and then hands him the cup and says, you finish it. And he lifts the cup up and turns it upside down and just drains every last drop out of it. And he said, well, that's the end of the wine, honey. And she said, but it was good wine. It stayed good through all these years, for what Jesus had done was a miracle, and his miracle has lasted a lifetime with us. But we know that wherever people gather in remembering him, the wine, that good quality wine that bestows the grace upon his people, and the healing will be there available for all.